So, Bismillah, let me start with the first question. It says, as it is said to recite more Quran than usual during the month of Ramadan, my question is, should we focus only and just only on reciting the Quran, or should we study tafsir and do memorization of the Quran in Ramadan as well? Okay, this is an excellent question. The month of Ramadan, yes, it is known as the Shahr al-Quran, the month of the Quran, for the very reason that the Quran was revealed in Ramadan. Also, we know that the Prophet ﷺ would review the Quran with the angel Jibreel every Ramadan from beginning to end. And in the year that the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he reviewed the Quran twice. And so it has been the practice of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions after him to pay special attention to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the month of Ramadan. Now, unfortunately, there are many people who have their relationship with the Quran is just memorizing the Quran. And sometimes this is more of a cultural issue where we're taught that the memorization of the Quran is the most important thing, or just the recitation. And if Arabic is not our native language and we may not understand Arabic, and sometimes, by the way, this is not just for people who are not Arab. Even Arabs sometimes, they may speak Arabic, but their dialect of Arabic can differ from classical Arabic or Fusha, what is known as the Arabic of the Quran. And so even somebody who is born into an Arab household and they speak Arabic, they may not have a great understanding of the meanings of the Quran. So sometimes, as I said, there's an emphasis on just reading the Quran or just memorizing the Quran. Now, when it comes to having a relationship with the Quran, and that's what our goal is, inshallah ta'ala, to have a relationship with the Quran. What does it mean to have a relationship with the Quran? I'm going to mention 5 or 6 things that we should try and focus on in the month of Ramadan, inshallah ta'ala. Number 1 is al-qira'ah, which is recitation. And that, I think most people, they do focus on that. We know that simply reciting the Quran, we are rewarded for it. The Prophet said that whoever recites a letter from the book of Allah will receive a good deed. And the Prophet said, I'm not saying, he said that alif, lam, mim is not one letter, rather alif is a letter, mim is a lam is a letter, and mim is a letter, meaning every single letter of the Quran that we recite, we receive reward for that. So the other extreme, by the way, is people who say like, don't recite the Quran, don't memorize the Quran, just look at the meanings of the Quran, which is the other extreme. And it should not be all or nothing. It shouldn't be just one or the other. And that's why I'm going to mention about 5 or 6 things here. But one of them, yes, just the recitation within of itself is important as well, even if we're not understanding anything. If we don't understand a single word of what we're reciting, just the act of reciting the Quran, intrinsically, it has reward in it. So yes, that should be part of our relationship with the Quran. So that's number 1, al-qira'ah. Number 2, scholars, they say al-itqan, which is proficiency of the Quran, which is working on becoming proficient in the Quran. That is basically trying to better our recitation of the Quran and to try to better our pronunciation of the letters and the words and tajweed and all of that. That is what is known as itqan or al-itqan, being proficient in the Quran. It doesn't mean you have to be proficient, but what it means is that you make an effort to be proficient in the Quran. And we know, as the Prophet told us, that a person who struggles with the recitation of the Quran, meaning a person who is not proficient with the Quran, a person who struggles, the Prophet told us that he has or she has an added reward, meaning not only do they have the reward of reciting the Quran, but all the struggle that they go through, they're rewarded for that as well. So even if we're struggling with the Quran, we are rewarded for that very struggle, even if we're not proficient, but working towards proficiency in reciting the Quran. Number 3, so we said al-qira'ah, al-itqan, and number 3 is khushu'. Khushu' is really presence of the heart, or we can say presence of the heart and the mind, right? So we don't want to have a relationship with the Quran where our hearts and minds are not present, because really part of the Quran and the reason why the Quran was sent Yes, it was sent for recitation, but also it was sent for us to learn and understand the meanings of the Quran. And khushu' can only be developed when we learn and understand the meanings of the Quran, which is what I will get to, inshallah ta'ala. So developing the presence of our heart, the presence of our mind when reciting the Quran. Number 4, al-tadabbur, which is basically contemplation of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ, that do they not ponder or do they not reflect upon the Quran, أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا, or are there locks upon their hearts? And here, this is a question by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to wake us up, to help us understand that if we're not contemplating the Quran, that if we're not reflecting upon the Quran, then we're not truly benefiting, we're not properly benefiting from the Quran. So part of having a relationship with the Quran is being able to, or is reflecting upon the Quran. And a prerequisite for that is obviously what I said earlier, al-fahm, which is understanding the Quran. So working towards understanding the Quran. How do we understand the Quran? Well, for some of us, that means looking up the meanings of the Quran and looking up the tafsir of the Quran to properly understand the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving to us. That's how we will develop khushu', what I spoke about earlier. And also, that is what will lead to this point number 4 of tadabbur al-Quran, which is reflecting upon the Quran. We don't want that our hearts be like they are locked up, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, are there locks upon the heart? Meaning, the Quran needs to penetrate our hearts. And how will it penetrate the Quran if we do not reflect upon the Quran? Now, a lot of times people ask me, how do you reflect upon the Quran? What does it mean? Or some people will say, look, I'm not a scholar. I cannot do tafsir of the Quran. I have to be very clear here. There is a very big difference. There's a clear difference between tafsir and tadabbur. No one is asking you to do tafsir, nor should you be doing tafsir. Tafsir should be done by those people who are qualified, those people who are educated in the deen and who are educated in the Quran to do tafsir. Tafsir goes into things like, what is Allah saying here? Why did Allah say it? What circumstances did Allah mention this ayah in? All of that comes under tafsir, and that comes with knowledge. Tadabbur happens after the knowledge, meaning once we understand, once the tafsir is done, we understand what Allah is saying, then we can do tadabbur. So tadabbur is different, is separate than tafsir. No one is asking you to do tafsir. Go look up the tafsir. Go look up the interpretation and the meanings and the message of the Quran. Do that, leave that to the scholars. But look it up. Once you know the meaning of the Quran, do tadabbur. Tadabbur is taking the meanings of the Quran and asking yourself, how does this relate to my life? How does this affect my life? What role does it play in my life? So, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا, that with hardship comes ease. Okay, so we have the qira'ah of it. We recite it. We want to make sure we recite it in the best possible way. We want to develop khushu' and tadabbur. We want to reflect upon the Quran. We have to first understand what it means. So when Allah says, إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا, that with hardship comes ease, that means, and this can go into the meaning and the tafsir of the Quran, that when Allah gives hardship, Allah also gives ease with it. That is the tafsir, that is the understanding. Also, part of the tafsir is that when Allah brings hardship, that always attached to that hardship is ease, meaning ease is connected to it. Ma'a, Allah said with, inna, certainly, ma'al usri yusra, with the hardship is the ease, meaning they're not separate, they'll be connected. After a hardship, there comes ease, either in this life or in the afterlife. So that is, now we have understood the Quran, we know the meanings of the Quran, we've recited the Quran. Tadabbur means we say, in my life, now that I understand that verse, in my life, how does this apply? Well, I'm going through this difficulty and that difficulty and this hardship. Tadabbur of the Quran means I say, okay, so how do I apply this to my life? Well, this gives me solace, it gives me comfort, because as difficult as things are right now, there is ease that is attached to it, meaning relief is going to come. Maybe not in this life, but maybe in the afterlife. Also, part of the tafsir of this ayah, which I forgot to mention, is that the yusr that Allah has mentioned, part of that yusr is a reward, right? The reward we get for going through a hardship and being patient. So, once again, tadabbur means, okay, I'm going through this hardship, whatever that particular hardship is to you, and you say, I know this is hard, but I know that if I'm patient with this hardship, then certainly there's yusr with it. Part of that yusr is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward me for that ease that I am going through. And so that is what we're talking about when we say tadabbur al-Quran, reflecting upon the Quran. Number 5, Hifz al-Quran, memorization of the Quran. And yes, that is part of it as well. We should make an effort in the month of Ramadan, as we're making the effort to recite and to reflect upon the Quran. We should make an effort to memorize the Quran as well. This doesn't mean you have to memorize 10 surahs of the Quran, or a juz of, or 2 juz of the Quran, or 3 juz. That's not what we're saying here. But what I'm saying is that you should make an effort to memorize something of the Quran, even if it is 1 ayah, even if it is small ayat of the Quran, but regularly memorizing and making a schedule for ourselves that we will add to our memorization of the Quran. And if we memorize the Quran, obviously the Hufaz know this, that for them a lot of times it's review of the Quran, right? Review and strengthening of what they have memorized. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, certainly the one who doesn't have anything of the Quran in their heart is like an abandoned house, or a ruined house. Meaning we all want something of the Quran. It doesn't mean you have to be a hafiz of the Quran, but what it means is that we should be making an effort to memorize something of the Quran, even if it's something very little or very small. So we said al-hifz al-Quran, hifz al-Quran. Number 6, and this is the last point I'll mention, is al-amal wa-tatbiq. This is acting and implementing the Quran into our lives. So this is part of reflecting upon the Quran, as I mentioned earlier, but this is now the practical aspect of living with the Quran. Meaning we take the message of the Quran and we apply it into our lives. And that was the methodology, that was the way of the companions. One of my favorite narrations that I mentioned a lot, subhanAllah, is the narration of Ibn Umar radiallahu anh, who said, it took me 4 years to memorize Surah Al-Baqarah. And I often compare this to the Hifz that we have today. Surah Al-Baqarah, some of you may know this, but it's about 2.5 juz of the Quran. For somebody who is memorizing the Quran, to memorize 2.5 juz, for somebody who's like really good at memorizing, they could do it very quickly. There's people who memorize the whole Quran in 2 years, right? But in the whole Quran in 2 years, there are Hufaz that will, and even less. I've heard of Hufaz who have memorized the whole Quran in less than 2 years. Ibn Umar, who was a Sahabi, he was a knowledgeable Sahabi, he was a scholar amongst the Sahaba, he had a very high rank. He said, it took me 4 years to memorize just 2.5 juz of the 30 juz of the Quran. Why? He said, because I would never pass a single verse of Surah Al-Baqarah except that I would implement it into my life. Subhanallah. This is why it took him so long. He said, I'm not going to move on. I'm not going to memorize another ayah until I've implemented. I can test it on the Day of Judgment. I can come and say, oh Allah, I heard the message and I applied it in my life. And because of that, he said it took me 4 years to memorize Surah Al-Baqarah. And that's why I don't believe we should be in a hurry, especially as adults. Children, it's another matter, right? Children, we should encourage them to memorize as much as possible, obviously to the best of their ability, and we don't want to pressure them. But children, is a different issue. But as adults, I don't believe we should be in a hurry just to memorize the Quran if we're not benefiting from the message of the Quran, if we're not doing tatbiq, if we're not implementing the message of the Quran. Yes, we should memorize, as I said, but part of that memorization should be implementation of the Quran. Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, once again, famous companion, he said, it was difficult for me to memorize the Quran, but it was easy for me to act upon the Quran. And subhanAllah, in our times, it is the opposite, right? We find it easy to memorize the Quran, but difficult to act upon it, right? But we want to go back to the way of the companions and their relationship with the Quran. So To review, if you didn't catch all of them, we said number one, al-qira'ah, recitation of the Quran. Number two, itqan, to work to be proficient in our recitation of the Quran. Khushu', developing the presence of heart and presence of mind with the Quran. We said that happens when we learn and understand the meanings of the Quran, when we look up the tafsir of the Quran, which is definitely a part of what we should be doing. Tadabbur, we said number four, tadabbur, reflecting upon the Quran. Number five, Hifz al-Quran, memorizing the Quran. And lastly, which is not a last point, but this is not in order of importance. This is all together. We should be doing all of this. Is tatbiq, is implementation of the Quran, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Sorry for a long answer to that question. It's just that that question is an excellent question because it is very relevant to the month of Ramadan. And alhamdulillah, we know that in the month of Ramadan, it may become easier for us to work towards bettering our relationship with Allah. And so this is an excellent time to build a relationship with the Quran that will hopefully continue with us even after the month of Ramadan. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.